Hello and welcome to SNI and to this special series on events regarded as seminal in India's diplomatic history. I'm referring to the nuclear deal with the US, and I have with me Ambassador Shyam Saran, former Foreign Secretary, who was one of the key architects of the nuclear deal. So when we look back on those years, it's now 11 years, what was the trigger, you could say, for the deal? Was it an idea from somewhere? Did it come as part of the larger negotiations between India and the US?
Well, there was no eureka moment as such. It never is. So we should look at a certain trajectory of the India-US relationship, which in a sense began with Clinton's visit to India, which in a sense reversed all the downside of the nuclear test that we did in 1998. And since then, there was a steady improvement of India-US relations and a sense that in the post-Cold War world, India and the United States had many more things in common than they had differences. That there was a certain overall strategic convergence building up between the two sides. So if you look at the relationship between India and the US during Vajpayee years, you would have heard about the next steps in strategic partnership, which was in a sense once again resuming some high-tech cooperation between the two countries in the space field, in the field of nuclear energy itself, but of course not reactors, but safety equipment or balance of plant equipment, and also looking at missile defense, if you remember. So the next steps in strategic partnerships in that sense was a precursor to the nuclear deal. And the conversations which we had in the context of the nuclear deal were really the growing sense that both India and the United States were in fact facing certain common challenges, of a long-term character, of a strategic character. So, for example, the emergence of China. Not necessarily looking at China as an enemy, but certainly looking at China's emergence as something which is changing, the global balance, the regional balance. How do we deal with that challenge? What about international terrorism, which had become a major preoccupation with the United States, as you know, after 9/11, and also has been a continuing challenge for India. And thirdly, a very real sense that both India and the United States, as very vibrant, plural democracies, again have a stake in each other's success. So this is the overall context within which we started looking at a strategic partnership between the two countries. And 2005 was the year when the Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, was going to the United States for a visit. It was supposed to be a visit where we would announce a strategic partnership between India and the US. So what would be the content of this partnership? And if we really wanted to take those convergences that I mentioned forward, then what is it that is standing in the way? And it is in that context that we said to the United States that if you wish us to be a partner, you cannot at the same time treat us as a kind of a target. So whether it is on the issue of the nuclear non-proliferation, the denial of high technology to India, the fact that you say you have an interest in a strong India, but whenever we have, a missile test, you condemn us.
Goes up.
So we cannot have both things together. So it is important for us to be able to deal with some of the negative legacies of the past. And in that context, this is one of the key negative legacies that we have to address. Also, don't forget that if we are looking at technology denial regimes, that was very directly linked to the sanctions on the nuclear side, because virtually all dual-use technologies which could be conceivably of use in the nuclear field was denied to us. So I think in that context, through those conversations, we looked at the overall global context. what are the convergences which India and the US have, and in that context, how do we really deal with some of these negative legacies.
Initially, when we raised the issue of the nuclear prohibitions against India, how did the Americans react?
Well, obviously the first reaction was that this is a very
No
difficult
way.
thing to difficult thing to do. But I think there was a sense that it is maybe worth doing. Because the payoff in terms of the India-US partnership, that payoff from the US point of view was seen as being quite significant. So if I look at say one other issue, say climate change and energy security. Our view to the United States, and not just to the United States, but to our Western partners, was that, look, if energy security and climate change is a major concern for you, then what energy choices India makes going forward
critical,
is going to be very important, because not only important for India, but it is important for the rest of the world. So if we decide, for example, like China, to go entirely in the direction of coal-based power, China was already developing, maybe every day there was a coal-based thermal power plant being set up. If we went in the same direction, this would have a very negative impact on the rest of the world as well, and including you. So if India has decided that one of the answers to the problem of dealing with climate change and also ensuring India's energy security is a rapid development, large-scale development of nuclear energy, which is a clean source of energy, and we have a capability in that area, it should be something that you should support rather than you should try to prevent us from developing that capability. So from the point of view of energy security and climate change also, enabling the resumption of civil nuclear energy cooperation between India and the rest of the world, it is something which is to your advantage.
Did the Americans at that point also look at, or perhaps look at the fact that it could be commercially lucrative for them? Was that ever raised?
Well, one is, of course, the American interest that if we are really going to do this, then we should have some benefit in terms of, say, larger sales of nuclear power plants. Don't forget that this was a time where even in the United States, which had not made a single new nuclear power plant for 20 years, there was a kind of a revival of interest in nuclear energy. So, Bush, for example, was talking about a nuclear renaissance in the United States, looking at, high technology as applied to the nuclear power sector, generation 4 reactors, for example. So there was certainly an interest that if we are going to do this and going to develop our nuclear energy market again, then we should be looking at what the commercial prospects are for companies like Westinghouse, companies like General Electric. But more than that, I think it would be perhaps fair to say that there was a great deal of interest in the military hardware industry. Because if the technology denial regimes linked to the nuclear issue, if those technology denial regimes were dismantled, then the way would be open for high-tech military sales to India. So during the period when we were trying to mobilize support for the nuclear deal within, say, the US Congress and other constituencies in the United States, trying to deal with the opposition from the non-proliferation lobbies, the influence of the major defense firms in the US was also very helpful.
So they were, in a sense, also lobbying for us, pushing our case?
Yes. They amongst the constituencies which were supportive of what we were trying to do, certainly the defense hardware companies were also very supportive.
So in that sense, when you look at the fact that the only people who appear to have benefited from this deal are actually the Russians, and nothing has really happened with the Americans. Is
Well,
that a...
with the Americans, I think partly don't forget that whatever may have been the prospects of a nuclear renaissance in the
didn't
United
happen.
States, it has not really come about. Secondly, I think the Fukushima nuclear disaster has very much, sort of cured the pitch for the progress of the nuclear industry. You see that in India as well. I mean, the kind of public support there used to be for nuclear power is no longer the case. So we are facing a different kind of a situation, and in that context, let us not forget that companies like, for example, Westinghouse are no longer American companies.
True, yeah.
They are actually have been bought over by the Japanese. Even if there was a willingness on the part of India to buy American nuclear reactors, you are dealing with a situation where who do you identify as the companies whom you are going to buy from? And also, I think we have to contend with the fact that the issue was made much more complicated because of the nuclear liability, civil nuclear liability bill, which complicated the whole situation. And although that particular matter has been perhaps resolved to some extent, maybe it will take a little time before we really get back to seriously looking at the purchase of nuclear power equipment, etc., from the United States. With the Russians, of course, we have a much longer history of cooperation. But I believe that we are also in negotiations with the French for nuclear power plants. In today's situation, the cost is going to be also a major factor, because thanks to Fukushima, there is much more stress now on safety features, on making certain that safeguards are there, effective safeguards are there. All that adds to the cost. But I think if you're looking at it from the point of view of the United States of America, in commercial terms, the main benefit has been to the American defense.
So in that sense, is there any, do you get the sense in your meetings with the Americans, some sense of regret perhaps, that the benefits of that deal haven't been fully realized as far as the Americans go?
No, I have not come across this. I mean, as I mentioned, that maybe the companies who saw certain commercial benefits on the nuclear side itself may have some complaint because of the mainly because of the civil liability, nuclear liability bill. But as I said, who could have thought in 2005 that within a space of just about 10 years or so, we would be one of the largest, purchasers of American defense equipment. Today, much of your air assets are actually American.
American.
So if you look at the transport fleet of the Indian Air Force, it is today the cutting edge of that is
even your naval maritime.
Right. So I don't think in those terms, commercial terms, you could say that there has been very little benefit. And in fact, the benefit has been quite large. But one should also look at the fallout in terms of diplomatic gains, in terms of strategic gains. I think both countries have benefited from that. I mean, certainly I could say that the benefit for India has been, number one, if nuclear energy development is a very major item on your energy strategy, then today you don't have a problem of accessing nuclear fuel. Don't forget that before we had the nuclear deal, there was even the danger of Tarapur, for example, closing down. Several of our other nuclear power plants were functioning at low capacity because of the shortage of nuclear fuel, and because of the NSG limitations, even friends like the Russians were not ready to supply us with nuclear fuel. So compare that with a current situation where we have long-term supply agreements with something like maybe 15 or 16 major supplier countries. So today, fuel is not a constraint on the development of your nuclear power industry. Other factors may be in the way, but this is no longer a constraint. And secondly, as I try to point out, that thanks to the nuclear deal, the whole sort of system of technology denial, many of our major high-tech companies were on the entity list. They were not allowed to access US technology or equipment. Today, India is one of the favored countries in terms of supply of technology. It has been given the status of what they call NATO plus. So technology denial is no longer an issue. And this was a major issue if you go back to 2004, 2005. If you look at what I mentioned, that whenever we would have a missile test, there would be some criticism from the United States. Today, you don't see that anymore. In fact, the US, in some tacit sense, supports the development of your military capabilities. So that's a very important change for us. And there is no doubt that after having spent so many years as an outlier as far as the nuclear regime is concerned, global regime is concerned, we are now very much part and parcel of that regime, of that nuclear order. These are, to my mind, these are very major gains.
So when you look at our position today, so we've come a long way. We are now seen as a partner of the US. But some of the issues still remain between India and the US in terms of they wanting us to be perhaps allies in a sense of the kind that they've always dealt with. And in that sense, perhaps India is not quite willing to go along.
Well, I think it was always clear, even when we were doing the nuclear deal, that India will be a partner, but India will not be an ally or a subordinate ally in the sense of, say, within the NATO alliance, or allies, close allies such as Japan or close allies such as Australia. What we spoke about in 2005, 2006 was that, look, with respect to what we have identified as major challenges, strategic challenges going forward, not something which is a tactical thing at the moment, but for example, the emergence of China. Now, obviously, India is deeply concerned about what is the impact of the emergence of China as a country with major, significant economic capabilities, military capabilities in our neighborhood. How do we engage with China, but how do we also, in a sense, constrain China from a unilateral assertion of its power, which is also a concern for the United States of America. Now, we are not saying that we will ally together with the United States, and particularly militarily, to contain China. But whatever we will do in order to safeguard our interests, to promote our interests in the region, for example, is something which also supports US objectives without our being your ally. And I think whatever may be some of the commentariat saying that India is not quite what we have expected to be, I think in the leadership circles in the United States, this was very clear. I mean, I myself, in several conversations that we used to have during that period, we made this very clear that don't look at India. That's why I said you cannot treat India as a partner and a target, but we see the logic of a partnership because of the fact that we are facing similar kind of challenges. And it makes sense for us to work together to deal with those challenges. But India cannot be a subordinate ally in the sense that other allies are. It is true that the United States of America may feel a little difficulty in dealing with what is neither a adversary nor an ally. This is a new kind of a beast in a sense. So it is also true that during the course of those negotiations on the nuclear deal, for both of us, for India, it was a learning process. For the United States of America also was a learning process, because not only were we trying to negotiate a very complex agreement on a very sensitive issue, but at the same time, we were trying to construct a very new kind of a relationship. It was new for us also, in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And for the United States of America also it was. So part of the complexity and the difficulty which we are having in negotiating this deal was also because of this, because the United States of America had expectations coming from a certain perspective. We had certain expectations coming from a certain perspective, and trying to somehow compromise between those two was not an easy task. But I think it is to the credit of the leadership of the two countries, and I would say certainly the teams which were engaged in those negotiations, that there was always a willingness to try and find ways around those difficult odds.
The current US administration, does it appreciate the nuclear deal, what it has brought to the India-US relationship, or does it see it as something which is over and done with and let's move forward, and that's not happening? Is that...
Well, the thing is that what is it that the United States administration today under Trump is looking for? I think it's not only a problem that India faces, it's a problem that other countries face also. So we are in a situation where it is difficult to see what is it that the US is looking for in its relationship with India, because that also keeps changing. But I would say this, that my sense is, I'm not in government, so I cannot say with that confidence, but my sense is that whatever may be the sort of what you are seeing out in the open, the cooperation between the two countries, for example, in the area of defense, the cooperation between the two countries in, say, the area of counterterrorism, these seem to be going forward smoothly. I mean, it's not that they have been impacted by whatever may be happening in the White House. So one may hope that while the US is going through this kind of political flux, and the world is going through a certain flux, eventually we will settle down to a solid relationship, because I think that the strategic convergences that I talked about are becoming, in fact, more compelling than they were, say, 10 years ago. So all the more reason why there should be, in fact, closer partnership between the two countries.
In the conversations that President Trump has had with Prime Minister Modi and others, is there a sense he has given of how he sees our relationship?
No, I think, from what I see, he has a good relationship with the Prime Minister. If you are looking at the totality of the US interactions with various countries, adversaries as well as allies, one can even take the view that India has got off somewhat lightly.
Absolutely. So far.
So far. Of course, we are facing a very complex situation. But other things being equal, I think the relationship, even with Trump, the personal relationship that he has with the Indian leadership, I think is perhaps the least negative that one can think about. And as I mentioned to you, that in some key areas, whatever may be happening, in terms of the superstructure, the infrastructure of the relationship, seems to be still fairly strong and moving forward.
On that note, Ambassador Shyam Saran, thank you very much for your perspective.
Thank you.
Pleasure talking to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.